So to dive into some code, I created a new Django project. I named it Bookstore because I'll play around with some book data. So like if we had a store where we are selling books, but that's of course totally up to you. You can simply create a new Django project with the Django admin command. And in there, I changed nothing except for my VS Code settings, which I added, which are the same settings I've been using in the previous course sections. Now, the idea here is that we now get started with Django models and therefore with working with a database. And hence, for this, I will now first of all open up that integrated terminal again, and then create my first app here. With the manage py file, I'll start an app and I'll simply name it book outlet. But the name is up to you. That's simply the part of the overall project where we're dealing with our books and with selling books and so on. Now here I don't have that SQLite file yet, so I will simply create it manually and create a db.SQLite-free file in here just like this. And in there I won't do anything, I just store it like this. Now in the book outlet folder, so in this app folder which I created, there we have this models.py file. And this is now the file which will become important for us when it comes to creating those Django models. So those classes, as I already said, which we'll then use to interact with the database and to store data there. The idea is that in this models.py file, we define our data entities. So blueprints for the data objects we're going to work with in this application. And here in this book outlet part, we're certainly dealing with some books, which we're selling, for example. Hence, in here in this models.py file, I'll add a class named book. The name is up to you, but of course it should describe the kind of data you want to represent by this model. And then this book class should extend another class. It should inherit from another class. And in Python, we do that by adding parentheses after the class name. And it should extend the models.Model class, which is a built-in class provided by Django. And this models import, which we need for that, should already be there. If it's not, simply add it manually. And then we add a colon and can now work on the class definition. So in here, in this class, we now want to define the structure of a single book. Keep in mind that SQL databases are table-based, so now in the end, we'll define the structure of a book table. We're going to define how our book entries should look like, which fields they should have. So for example here, we could say that every book has a title. Hence, we add a title field, a title attribute here to this class. And we now, and that's important, we now want to assign a value here. And the value now is not a title like Harry Potter. That's not what we want to add here, because our class should just be the blueprint for book instances, which we then create thereafter. And it would be the concrete instance, which, for example, has a title of Harry Potter. Instead, the value we define here in the class is simply an indicator for Django that tells Django which kind of data we later want to store in a title. And here we know that we want to store some text in there. That title should be some text. And to be very precise, we need to tell Django which kind of text field it should create in the database. And you can Google for Django Model field reference to find an article from the official docs where you have a list of all the officially supported built-in field types you can set. You can also build custom types, but that's beyond the scope here. But if you scroll down on the right here to field types, then you have a list of field types you can set. And for example, for the title, I want to set a CharField type. You see that here? A CharField is a string field for small to large sized strings. So what I want to do here is I now want to set this to models.CharField. And that's important You get those value types which you can assign from the models module, which we're importing from Django.db. That then exposes a couple of classes in the end, which we instantiate, like the CharField class. And behind the scenes, that tells Django that when later a book is created and stored in the database, that book will have a text value type, and then because it's the CharField constructor, the CharField class which we're using here, Django also knows a couple of other things. For example, that it won't be a super large text, so not like the content of a book, which would be a very long text, but that it's a, well, small text or a reasonably large text, but definitely not a text that spans multiple book pages, for example. And that is because we use the CharField class here. Now, to CharField, we actually should add one argument when we call the constructor as we're doing it here, and that's the named max length argument, which we should pass here. You can pass arguments to these field type classes when you construct them, and there are a couple of optional arguments. We'll have a look at some of them later, but some fields also have necessary arguments which you need to provide. And max length here actually is required. As you see here in the official docs, CharField has one extra required argument, and that's the max length argument. And there you simply define the maximum length of text that may be stored here in the database later for this field. And we could say that a title shouldn't be longer than, let's say, 50 characters. Of course, this value is up to you. Now with that, we'll tell Django that it has to check the title of a book later when we insert a book into the database and deny the insertion if the title would be too long. Now we can also add another field, and let's say we also want to add a rating here to our book. For that, I'll add a rating attribute. Again, these attribute names are up to you. You just have to ensure that you don't use reserved names like, for example, pass, which is a keyword in Python. But other than that, it's up to you. And here, I don't want to set this to a char field, but instead to a number. And to be precise, I want to set it to a number without any decimal places. So I'll set this to an integer field. Now here you see in this little box which my IDE gives me which arguments we could pass in here, but these are all optional arguments because if we have a look at the integer field documentation, if we go there, that this does not have any required parameters which you need to pass and no required arguments. You can pass in certain options, but you don't have to. And now with that, we would define that we want to have a book data entity in our application, in our website, where every book that we create later has a title and has a rating. And Django will then go ahead and create a database table called books. It takes your class name, converts it to all lowercase and pluralizes it. And in that books table, it will then automatically set up a title column which accepts text with a max length of 50, and a rating column which wants integer numbers. And that's also important, it will automatically create an ID column which has an auto-incrementing number. You could explicitly set this here by using models autofield, but you don't have to. This is added to every data entity automatically by Django. And this auto-incrementing ID field is very helpful because that gives you a unique identifier for every data entry. Because of course, at the moment, we could use the same title on multiple books, so that would not be unique. Hence, having such a clearly unique field is definitely something which can be helpful for identifying entries. But enough of that. At the moment, we only have our class. We have nothing in the database yet. So how can we make sure that we now actually do set up the database, that this table gets created, and how can we then insert data and so on?